welcome to all of you who are continuing with us this morning. We now have our session devoted to the theme of empathy and human compassion. Here we begin to look at a particular set of emotions that are other-centered in nature and where there are very profound contributions in the personalist tradition. I'm not quite sure what we'll be hearing from our panelists, but I know it will be quite rewarding. So we will go first to Professor Crosby, who will address us first. Professor Crosby is, as most of you know, Professor of Philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville, co-founder of the Hildebrand Project and a senior fellow with the Hildebrand Project. Then we will hear from Professor Josef Seifert, who is with us from Austria. Professor Josef Seifert is known to many of you as the founding rector of the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein, which for many decades and through all of its students, former students, its alumni, and the ongoing work of Josef has been one of the most instrumental institutions for the promotion of the thought and legacy of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and of course the other figures to whom Josef has devoted himself, Karol Wojtyła, Edith Stein, and many others, Max Scheler, and so on. So we're delighted to have Josef with us. Josef is also a Hildebrand Project Fellow at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and we're very happy to have him in that affiliation as well. So with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Crosby.
All right, thank you. Thank you, John Henry, and welcome, Josef. I'm delighted to be with you in this panel on the theme of empathy and compassion as a distinct domain of the affective life, the heart life of the human person. I'll divide my comments between some important insights of von Hildebrand and then offer in a second part some important insights of Max Scheler on the subject. I think the name of Scheler is in the title of this session, and in fact, on topics like compassion, Scheler has tremendously much to say. So in my presentation on Monday, I reflected on the Good Samaritan and on the fact that he is said to have been moved by compassion in helping the injured man. You may remember that I compared the Good Samaritan who acted with compassion with another kind of Good Samaritan who would act only from duty. I said this by way of introducing the thought of Newman to you, and now I return to this example of the Good Samaritan with the goal of introducing von Hildebrand to you, and in particular his thought on the affectivity of compassion. And I want to capture briefly 4 of von Hildebrand's ideas about compassion. First, the Good Samaritan who lacks heartfelt compassion may deeply regret that he lacks it and may ardently wish that he had it, but he cannot will heartfelt compassion into existence. He can will to bind up the wounds of the injured man, and he can will to transport him to the inn, but he cannot in the same manner of will to do these things in a heartfelt way. The affective compassion comes and goes as it will, and when he has it, he is aware of receiving it as a kind of gift. Now, this point has been made multiple times in the various sessions, and just this morning by Mark and Beth, but it's so fundamental to von Hildebrand that it bears, I think, restating. So that's the first aspect of compassion that von Hildebrand notices. And here is a second one. The Good Samaritan who is affectively inert and who acts entirely from duty is not fully present in the act of helping. He is not in this act with his whole being, to take an expression of Martin Buber. You may remember how Buber says in the I-it relation to another, you're never present with your full being. But in a real I-thou relation, you're always present with your whole being. So there is a plenitude, a full-bodiedness in the helping person that only the compassionate heart can give. The conscientious will alone cannot give it. And as a result, the Good Samaritan, who is effectively inert, does not fully reach the injured person. He keeps him at a distance and remains somehow enclosed in himself, however benevolent his actions toward the injured man may be. On the other hand, the Good Samaritan who acts with heartfelt compassion closes that distance, steps out of himself, and becomes more available to the injured man. That availability, in the sense of Gabriel Marcel, fits exactly here. The Good Samaritan, effectively engaged, is more available in helping than the effectively inert helper can be. And then thirdly, von Hildebrand gets a third fundamental idea about the heart, and in particular compassion, when he puts together these two ideas. So the fact that the heart is not in our full control, and the fact that we achieve this plenitude of presence and availability. But Hildebrand thinks that if we put of the person together with his lack of control over this full presence, then there results a striking image of the creaturehood of the human person. And so he says, in the heart, in a very significant passage, and I quote, typical of man's createdness is the existence of a depth dimension of his soul which does not fall under his mastery, as do his voluntary acts. Man is greater and deeper than the range of things he can control with his free will. His being reaches into mysterious depths which go beyond what he can engender or create. End of that quote. So the third idea is this image of our creaturehood that results from the first 2 points. And then there is a fourth aspect of compassion that I would like to call attention to. We could call it a certain deep vulnerability that is found in heartfelt compassion and in many other affections. Now, when Hildebrand doesn't use exactly that term, vulnerability, but he gives us the tools for examining this when he draws an extremely important distinction in his book on the heart between what he calls tender affectivity and what he calls merely energized affectivity. Tender affectivity, as for example, David mourning for his son Absalom, has a distinctly intimate note. It involves the heart of a person. This in contrast to the energized affectivity of uproarious laughter or the frenzied cheering of sports fans in a stadium, an affectivity that entirely lacks the personal intimacy of tender feeling. This intimate character of tender affectivity is shown in the shame that it typically awakens, not the shame we feel when we are aware of what is bad and shameful in ourselves, but the shame we feel in exposing in public what is intimate in ourselves. It is this shame that expresses the vulnerability of which I speak. Now, our subject here is compassionate love, and I want to say that it is, this compassion, one of those tender affections, and hence characterized by this vulnerability. Now, why would this be important for understanding compassion and other affections? Because it shows why we tend to shrink from feeling compassion and why we almost need a certain courage if we are to welcome this feeling. It does not take much courage to cheer for the home team at a sports event because there is no particular vulnerability that we are exposed to. But heartfelt compassion has the kind of affectivity that makes us vulnerable, and so it is understandable that we often prefer to repress our compassion so as to avoid the vulnerability. In fact, it is understandable that a good Samaritan would prefer to be driven by duty alone and not also by heartfelt compassion. He may even be very energetic in helping the injured man precisely as a way of avoiding showing him heartfelt compassion, precisely as a way of offering a substitute for giving his heart to the injured man. So we've already seen in other sessions that we show our real self, as Van Hildebrand says, in these tender affections. But one might think that we're all eager to actualize our real self and want nothing more than this. But in fact, it takes courage to actualize one's real self. We have to overcome our natural shrinking away from the vulnerability that it involves, and to have the courage to be fully present as who we really are, and in this way, to be available to others in heartfelt compassion. So that's that's a few thoughts of Van Hildebrand, 4 of them to be exact, on compassion. You see, of course, that these 4 are common to other affections. It's not exactly compassion is distinct from everything else. That is my subject here. Now I turn to Max Scheler. It was, after all, Max Scheler who first announced in his book Formalism and Ethics a rehabilitation of the heart. And Van Hildebrand owes tremendously much in his own thinking on the heart to what he received from his revered teacher and friend. And I want to pick out 2 ideas in Scheler that take us deeper into compassion. Now, Scheler engages Nietzsche in debate on compassion and pity. We all know how Nietzsche despised compassion as weak and servile. Scheler shows that Nietzsche despised compassion only because he misunderstood what it was. He mistook it for a form of emotional infection. Compassion has, in fact, nothing to do with emotional infection, Scheler argued, since compassion is an eminently personal way of relating to the suffering of another. Now let me explain what Scheler means by emotional infection and by eminently personal. Let's suppose that you join the company of people who are mourning the death of a dear friend of theirs. You did not know their friend and so have no reason of your own for mourning with them, but the dismal, mournful atmosphere of the gathering infects you with a mournful spirit. Scheler grants that the mourning of these people is certainly motivated, that is, they have a reason for mourning, but the gloom you pick up by associating with them is not in the same way motivated. It's not based on anything you've understood. Your gloom, Scheler says, and the example is taken from him, is caused rather than motivated. Your gloom lacks the subject-object polarity of an intentional act. It is not a gloom about something, but rather an objectless gloom that overtakes you. Your gloom is a perfect specimen of what Scheler and others have called emotional contagion or emotional infection. It is a subpersonal form of affective life, as can be seen by the fact that this emotional contagion is found among animals. When an alpha animal senses danger and feels fear, his fear spreads by infection through the whole herd he is leading. When a small child senses its mother's fear, the child undergoes the same mechanism of infection. The child does not perceive the danger that the mother perceives and is not moved by the perceived danger to feel fear. The small child rather undergoes the more primitive, non-intentional affectivity of emotional contagion. And there are many examples of this contagion. You know how laughter can spread through a group by contagion. You've seen amusing situations of altar servers. One starts giggling, he infects the others, and the infection spreads rapidly through the whole would be typical emotional infection. Even a bodily thing like yawning, as we know, can be transmitted by infection. Scheler has the interesting thought that even situations in nature, like a cold, foggy day, can infect us with a certain dismal feeling. Now, Nietzsche treated compassion and pity as kinds of emotional infection. The misery of another infects us, he thought, with a similar misery. And that is all there is to having compassion with a sufferer. One understands why Nietzsche, on this basis, called compassion the multiplier of misery. But Scheler argues that Nietzsche thereby misses entirely the phenomenon of compassion. Notice that the misery you acquire by infection is your own misery, and that you do not enter into the misery of another, just like the gloom you acquire by infection. And our other example is your own gloom, and not the gloom of those who mourn for their friend. But the achievement of real compassion, says Scheler, is precisely entering into the suffering of the other as other. You understand what his suffering means for him. And showing compassion to him means wanting to be with him in his suffering and to offer consolation and support to him or to her. There is then a self-transcendence achieved in compassion that is entirely lost on Nietzsche. Even more important, there is an element of love in compassion that is equally lost on Nietzsche. This transcendence, an element of love, explain why compassion is an eminently personal act. Consider the comfort that is conveyed by compassion. The suffering person is comforted only because he is taken seriously in his own right, in his own suffering. If he thought that the compassionate person were simply another center of suffering outside of himself, why would he feel comforted? In fact, it would be depressing, not comforting, to think that one's own suffering is spreading beyond oneself, like a kind of coronavirus of suffering. Real compassion, Scheler said, doesn't add to suffering, but encounters it and relieves it. Using the language of von Hildebrand, we could say that the suffering other is eminently thematic in compassion. You know, he uses that expression that in love, the beloved person is fully thematic. And so that language works here in discussing compassion. But if Nietzsche were right, the suffering of the other would be completely hidden by the suffering that infects the compassionate person. So that's one Schelerian thought on compassion. He helps us defeat a notorious reductionistic account of compassion. Now, and here is my last point. Scheler also helps us to defeat a famous metaphysical account of compassion. Scheler entered into debate with Schopenhauer, who held that through the experience of pity and compassion, we come to think that the distinctness among persons is illusory. Schopenhauer thinks that by entering into a suffering person, by compassion, I discover that the distinction between myself and the other is illusory. As long as I refuse compassion to the other, he or she seems to be other than myself. But as soon as I practice compassion, I am drawn into a certain oneness of being that is prior to the distinction between self and other. I and the others are dissolved into this oneness of being. You see why Scheler spoke of this position of Schopenhauer as a metaphysical monism, a reduction of a plurality to one at the ultimate level of being. Now, Scheler, by force of his personalism, is fiercely opposed to this dissolution of personal individuality. He argues convincingly that the experience of compassion, in fact, confirms the individuality of persons, confirms that this is not a thing of appearance, but an ultimate reality. Here is one of Scheler's arguments, and with this I conclude. He says that we tend at first to approach other people in an egocentric way, experiencing ourselves as the really real being and others as shadowy beings orbiting around ourselves. Treating others as objects makes it easy to treat them as existing only relative to ourselves, and hence as more or less unreal. But when we approach them, Scheler says, not as objects, but by way of Mitgefühl, or translated into English as fellow feeling, of which compassion is one main form, then we are confronted with the reality that they have in their own right. And we're forced to realize that they are as real as we are. This means that compassion with another inflicts on us the otherness of the other, thus reinforcing the sense of the difference between ourselves and others. This difference is then not eroded by compassion, as Schopenhauer thought, but confirmed and heightened. So, those are the two thoughts of Scheler on our subject of compassion. And with that, I will turn it over to Joseph.
So, thank you very much, John. I'm very happy to see that without me reading your message of what you will speak about, we have chosen more or less completely different topics. The because you spoke almost only on compassion. And the other topic of the empathy was not treated very much by you. And therefore, I will now add this topic.
Good. A beautiful pre-established harmony between your present and mine.
Very happy. Yeah. Okay. So I would like to say that the topic of empathy is, I think, not primarily an effective response or something that belongs to the topic of the heart, but more an intellectual or cognitive act. But it has connections with the heart, and therefore Mark Spencer's constant reminder that we should not carve out these differences, but see their unity, will be splendidly demonstrated by this case of the empathy. But the empathy touches a very important topic, important for all human community, for love, for friendship, for marriage. And it is the very kind of, philosophically speaking, mysterious capacity of man or woman to somehow comprehend or perceive the inner conscious life of another person. If we could not do that at all, we would be totally isolated monads that could not really enter into contact with the inner life of another person. And therefore the question, how do we know other subjects? How do we know other persons? And above all, how do we know their inner experiences is of crucial importance. We can know, of course, other persons in many, many ways. For example, we can get information about when and where they have been born, where they have been brought up, where they went to school, to which university they went, and so on. But all of these kinds of knowing another person do not refer to that inner conscious life of the other person. And therefore, when we ask, how do we know that? How do we know the love of another person? How do we know the gratitude or the hatred or the goodness or badness or virtue or vice of the other person? Then we come to this question that occupies us here. And here we may say that there are still many ways of knowing the other person. For example, the other person can tell us, can communicate to us many things about her inner life. We can also get much knowledge of another person by what Husserl calls the Kundgabefunktion, that if somebody, for example, expresses a judgment about something, we at the same time get some knowledge of the kind of act of judging that he performs. Or if he asks a question, we at the same time receive some knowledge that he is searching or seeking an answer to a certain question. Or if he gives an order, a command, then we know that the act of commanding. So by understanding the acts that underlie certain utterances of commands, of wishes, of desires, of questions, of judgments, we get quite a knowledge also of the subject who is speaking. And there he doesn't have to speak about himself, yet we, so to speak, he reveals in turning with his thought or with his utterances to other subjects. He at the same time reveals many of his own acts. And then there's another very mysterious and profound form of getting to know other persons, which Hildebrand and also Max Scheler have investigated very deeply, namely the phenomenon of expression, in the sense that many inner acts and feelings and emotions that a person has are not just purely interior, but they are expressed in the physical sphere, in the facial expression, in the voice, in the tone of voice, in many aspects of the appearance of a person. So that we can have faces that are disfigured by anger and hatred and resentments and terroristic criminal mindset. And we can have the faces of saints, which to look at moves us deeply by seeing somehow the goodness and the holiness of the person that expresses itself in the body. And that kind of knowledge is a kind of immediate givenness of something that is not the expression itself. So to speak, the expression, quite mysteriously, because it's a physical expression, the color of the face, a shape or smile and so on. But that reveals something quite different, an interior act or attitude, a virtue or vice, a anger or love or hatred. And that it becomes so immediately manifest that any theory that we simply project our own feelings into these expressions, or any kind of thing that we only know the other person's feeling because when we look at the mirror, we see that we make the same kind of face when we are angry as the other. These are all quite inept attempts to grasp that kind of knowing other persons through the expression in their face and voice. I once made a terrible immoral experiment to prove that this is not at all a inference of analogy from our own facial expression that reveals these different inner experiences of other persons by looking at a baby in a long line of people waiting in Paris when I studied in Paris. And I smiled at the baby and the baby smiled back sweetly. And suddenly I made a very evil face and the baby started to cry and to cry and to be totally, totally shocked by my expression. I then changed it back to the smile, and so I tried to not to cause a permanent psychological harm to the baby. But that shows that the baby certainly did not look at the mirror and see that he makes similar faces to express goodness, kindness, or evilness. But that's a kind of immediate grasp and understanding. And there are many other ways in which we know other persons, for example, by observing their actions, by observing their deeds, their good or bad deeds, like the Samaritan's deed, that also reveals much of the other person. And now, when we come to and Edith Stein, in her important work on empathy, her doctoral dissertation, which was then published parts 2 to 4 as a book, and is now also part of the complete works of Edith Stein that the convent of Carmelite convent of Cologne offers for free on internet as an e-books. And in this book, in the volume 5 on empathy, in German that means Einfühlung, so that has again a relation to feeling, like it means something like feeling into or feeling in somebody. And in this work, she claims that all forms of knowing other persons are actually Einfühlung. That Einfühlung is, so to speak, the general essence of knowing other person's inner life. And I think that maybe we should distinguish different forms of knowing other persons, and maybe based on each of them, it is possible to have this Einfühlung. But I think Einfühlung means something more than simply being a genus of how we know other persons' inner life. So what would this more consist in? And there are many theories about that, which also Edith Stein discusses critically. one of Scheler or Lips, who claim that our stream of consciousness is the same, identical with the other person. We can, so to speak, feel the same thing that the other feels. And Edith Stein very much resists this idea by saying that each person is an individual and unique, and he can only feel his own joy immediately in an originary way, and we cannot feel that joy as he feels it. And the others claim that, we just, there are many theories about what the Einfühlung consists in. But let me not speak critically about these different interpretations of empathy, but say that I think, and Edith Stein also develops that idea somehow contrary to her first claim that it's just a general term for any form of knowing other persons' inner life. She describes this Einfühlung in a very, very empathetic way. And she says that this empathy implies that we somehow are able to put ourselves into the shoes or under the skin of another person. And we are, so to speak, capable of in the other person's inner acts as if sharing from the look from within of the other person. And she adds in another part of her work that thereby we also get to know ourselves more deeply and more completely, because we know ourselves not only in the first person perspective from the inner conscious experience, the immediate experience we have of our own conscious acts and conscious life, but we also experience ourselves, as it were, through empathy as the other person perceives us, as the other person experiences us. So just as we can in some way also experience the other person from within. And so to speak, that enables us to partake and to know the inner conscious life of another person, which is a quite mysterious and profound and most important faculty. But at the same time, through, so to speak, perceiving ourselves in the empathy with the way other persons perceive us, we get to know ourselves, so to speak, from a third person perspective or second person perspective. And so this empathy is not yet a compassion or a Mitfühlen. As a matter of fact, the empathy is not necessarily something positive, because the empathy is also something that a devil can have and probably has more better than anyone else, namely to somehow understand how another person feels from within. For example, a sadist has to have this knowledge. In order to enjoy the sadistic torturing of the other person, he has somehow to grasp how the other person from her inner aspect will experience that pain. And so to speak, for the viciousness of sadistic torture, this empathy, this capacity, this cognitive capacity of somehow grasping how something affects the other person from within is also a condition. But of course, we look at it mainly for the role it plays in the positive life of the person, and particularly in the positive affective life of the person. Because in order to, for example, to feel being loved by the other, we have to have this empathic grasp of the other person's love somehow as if from within the other person. Of course, that cannot be real within, as Lips or other interpreters who were, so to speak, monists who effaced the difference between persons thought. But it is a kind of intentional and cognitive entering the inner life of the other person. And that, of course, is also quite necessary for compassion, because in order to have compassion, we somehow have to grasp how the falling under the bad treatment of the robbers, of the goods, of the Samaritan, of the man who is hit and wounded by the robbers. The good Samaritan has to somehow understand how this pain affects the other person in order to have this full compassion. It is also very important, this empathy, for what Hildebrand calls the intentio benevolentiae of his seventh chapter of his book, The Nature of Love. Because there he says that somehow in love, in the benevolence of love, we see the objective good for the other person from the point of view that it's an objective good for her. And so we somehow need to have this capacity to so to speak, enter into the door of the conscious life of the person, which as such is not immediately, not tangible, not visible, not immediately present to ourselves, but to enter it and to somehow rejoice and affirm the good for the other person, that which makes her happy, that which is a gift for her, under that point of view that it addresses itself, this objective good for the person, to the unique center of the other person. So there is a kind of special transcendence, more in a certain way or different. Hildebrand calls it an Überwertantwort, more than the value response as such, in which we recognize the intrinsic value of the other person. But in this benevolence, we also, so to speak, partake in the objective good that is always addressed for one particular person. And yet, in loving, we can share that we can respond to the good for the other under the aspect that it's good for her or for him. So again, we need to have this capacity, this amazing capacity of somehow crawling under the skin of the other person, putting on the shoes of the other person, which are just only images for this experiencing and so to speak, understanding, grasping the inner life of the other person from her perspective. Because each conscious act has, as it were, two different aspects. Like the one that is the inner aspect of ourselves. We experience our joy from within, or our love, we experience it from within. And we, in a certain way, see the love of another person, or joy of another person from without, as object of our perception. But in this empathy, and also in this intentio benevolentiae in Hildebrand's book on the nature of love, we somehow are capable of entering in such a way in love in the other person that what affects her we experience as it is good and provides happiness to this other person whom we love. And Hildebrand adds still a third dimension, which also requires this capacity of empathy, namely that it becomes that what is a source of happiness of the beloved person also becomes, for that reason that it's good for the other person, an objective good for us. So speak, an indirect objective good for us. Because it is the source of your joy, it becomes a joy for me that it is your joy, or that it is your happiness. So all these different steps that Hildebrand distinguishes in a masterful way in chapter 7 of his book, The Nature of Love, require this capacity, this cognitive capacity of empathy. And one could say, if we did not possess this capacity, then we would be, so to speak, always remain in some sense an isolated self who looks at other person as mere objects and who could not in any way enter their inner life. Now, this entering is does not make us, so to speak, well, it's so to speak of a peculiar kind. And Edith Stein, for example, denies that inner life of the other person can ever be given in an originary experience to ourselves. But she makes some rather complicated distinctions to point out that the original way in which the other person experiences her own joy, her own happiness, her own love, her own sadness is something we can never reach, or we can never have ourselves as it is experienced by the other. But nevertheless, I think so the transcendence of knowledge, and so this peculiar kind of empathy, which is a knowledge of the conscious life of the other person, not just as object of our knowledge that the other person is thinking and learning and rejoicing, but as, so to speak, entering into her so that we experience it in some way as if we were inside the other, and we experience it somehow as it affects or as it just from within. And therefore, I think without exhausting this topic here, which is impossible, I will conclude with this remark and just praise God that He gave the persons this quite unique capacity, of which I believe that in the eternal blessedness we will experience it fully. And I remind here of the concluding work of St. Anselm of Canterbury in his Monologion, where he says, or in his Proslogion, I'm not now sure, where he speaks of heaven. And he says that in heaven we will have an immense blessedness and happiness which no human tongue can tell how big it is, how great it is. But this blessedness will multiply with each other person whom we love in heaven, so that our blessedness for the happiness of another person in heaven will be equally great as the happiness of our own happiness. So that there will be like a multiplication by an infinite or immense number of our happiness. And he says that our happiness over the happiness of God will even be infinitely greater than our happiness of our own happiness. And so I would say that this vision of heaven of St. Anselm would mean the complete perfection of this marvelous gift of empathy.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. Those were wonderful remarks, but for our always a melting clock, we could have gone on. So there are many questions here, as we've had in all of our sessions, and I'm going to try to ask you just a few of them, and maybe we'll go over just by a few minutes. So I thank everyone who's with us. If you want to hear these questions, please stay a little bit after the hour here. Here's a question for you, Professor Crosby, and I'll just reach back to this because we have also many questions about empathy. But here's a question, if I understand it correctly, it's trying to wrestle with the absence of compassion in a Good Samaritan who nevertheless does the good actions despite lacking the compassion. And I think the implication here is there not moral excellence of its own? He says, the questioner asks whether in the case of the Good Samaritan that feels compassion compared to a Good Samaritan who doesn't, which of these two Good Samaritans is wishing more the good of the other for the other and not to satisfy his own needs? So perhaps there's some concern about the compassion becoming a kind of reward, an emotional reward along the way that somehow removes some of the moral purity of the person who does it just out of goodwill, shall we say. Perhaps you could address that, Professor Crosby.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't see that the element of compassion has to introduce anything egocentric into the helping. That seems to be the implication, that there's a greater selflessness in feeling nothing but just doing resolutely the right thing and helping. But I think that I would still want to say that this, as I call, greater availability to the other, comes in only with the compassion, and that enhances the gift that the helping person makes to the person in need. Now, of course, if a person really regrets his affective deadness, you know, so often people on the occasion of the death of someone dear to them just can't grieve as they want, and they deplore that as a great lack in themselves. Well, if that doesn't hinder them from doing all the right things, then you know, there's a certain strength of character and cleaving fast to the good and the right in one's actions, despite the affective deadness. But still, it's a substandard case. It seems to me the ideal, morally and humanly speaking, is the helping action sprung from a certain heart full of compassion for the sufferer. After all, that is explicitly said in Scripture when the Good Samaritan is described by Jesus. Moved with compassion, he stopped. So I don't see how that can fail to be somehow the gold standard in terms of helping, this compassion-filled act of helping. But Joseph may see it entirely differently and want to add something to that.
Well,
no, I think.
Go ahead, Joseph.
I think you spoke so well that I cannot add anything now.
Professor Crosby,
that usually means I know that Joseph wasn't listening closely to what I said, and therefore he pays me this overflowing compliment.
Are you maligning me again?
No. Uh-oh. So, John Henry, turn us to another question.
So, well, building on this previous question, there are a number of questions here that again, that you've, I think, spoken to here, but they have to do with obstacles to compassion. Here's a question about compassion fatigue for people who work in helping professions like psychology or trauma care, when constant deep empathy can be exhausting and paralyzing. And then the same person continues along the line of some other questions along the same lines. With the constant bombardment of information today via the internet, how does the common man display appropriate compassion when faced with the seemingly near omnipresence of suffering? And that raises, some others have asked the same thing, whether the proximity, shall we say, of, for example, a moral evil has any bearing on whether we ought to feel sort of profound compassion, or whether there are instances where, you know, maybe it's more of an intellectual compassion, but where we can't enter into it. But as a general matter, there's the questions here concern sort of the difficulty in feeling it, particularly in cases where it could be profoundly draining for someone who would be presented with endless needs in their professional work, say.
Yes, no, that's a very interesting concept, compassion fatigue. And obviously the doctor in the emergency room can't, you know, break down and weep and express compassion and with convulsive feelings and emotions, but has to somehow restrain himself effectively in order to help effectively in an emergency situation. But on the other hand, one would think that even the most hard-pressed emergency room doctor is still going to find a way to communicate something heartfelt there in his or her way of helping the patient. I mean, the patient isn't just, you know, reduced to a broken machine because he's so burned out with overload of compassion, but some continuing acknowledgement of a suffering person and some compassion, you know, restrained and adapted to the emergency circumstances would still seem to be necessary. And it's something as a real failing occurs when the patient now is just treated like a broken machine.
Joseph, would you like to add something to that, or can I pose another question here?
Yeah, pose another question.
Okay. Well, there's a question here that that explores that it sort of takes up the question of the supposed moral neutrality of empathy, and this is the case of the person who uses empathy in order to gain, you might say, access to someone, but for morally evil purposes. So, for example, where is this question here? The case of the torturer who has a high level of empathy in the sense that they can read the emotions of the other. And this, of course, is then used not in order to console the person, but the question is I suppose touches on the degree to which empathy is morally neutral. Is it a kind of moral of cognition that then gains its moral status on the basis of what's done, or is there not is not empathy perhaps in a deeper sense deeply formed by the moral status of the person seeking to be empathetic? In other words, that the love with which one seeks to be empathetic provides yet a deeper insight into the other person.
That's an excellent question, and I would say that that of course the empathy is in the sense morally neutral, in the sense that the evil, the devil, must have it in order to seduce us, but also in order to torment the damned. So the devil has it, no doubt, and so to speak, the joy of the evil joy of the sadist and torturer would not be really possible if he simply looked at that from without, if he could not somehow feel or grasp how that feels to the person who receives the torture. But of course, by this evil intention and by this evil attitude, so to speak, the empathy sees only that which is relevant for the evil of the torture. And so, of course, and the attitude of the empathy is completely disrespectful and, so to speak, totally annihilating the dignity of the person, negating the dignity of the person. Therefore, it is itself kind of an evil, takes part in the evil intention, and therefore has, so to speak, a disvalue because it makes the evilness of the sadist even more evil than it would be if he could not have this empathy. On the other hand, the reverent, loving empathy is, of course, formed by love and is a respectful, reverent, loving, partaking, and in, so to speak, in grasping the way in which the joy and happiness affects the beloved person. It rejoices with the beloved person. So it's in a certain way a completely different kind of empathy, but both imply that somehow I grasp of how it feels from within, but under the, so to speak, completely different quotation marks, or under completely different aspects, in such a way that we could say the empathy that is part of this holy blessedness in heaven and the empathy that the devils show is incomparable. The one is also empty, evil, reducing the person. And the other is, so to speak, the rich, immense part part of the beatitude of the blessed in heaven and of our vision of God. So it's quite true. I think I fully agree with the remarks of this person, who I don't know who it was, but it was an excellent remark.
Yes, it was very good. Well, let's take one last question in the interest of trying to capture the many questions being raised here. There are a number of people asking questions here who are psychologists or therapists, and they're asking extremely good questions that in a way we probably can't get into here, but they deserve good answers. But let's take a question that tries to address some of what they're asking with what many others are asking, which go down the line of cultivating empathy. So here's the question. How do we avoid misreading the other person when trying to practice empathy? Perhaps we impose something on them they are not actually thinking or feeling, since we are still looking through our own lens. Can you speak to this? So I suppose you could say the question has to do with the kind of native, maybe a kind of native or structural liability within empathy, but then also the question of proper cultivation.
Yeah, that's another excellent question, because this knowledge of empathy is in no way infallible. This knowledge of empathy also implies an element of interpreting the expression of another person. For example, one can be very much deceived and very much led into errors by what one believes to be a true empathic knowledge of the inner life of the other person. And that being misled can be the fault of the other person. For example, if he is a kind of actor or actress and mimics emotions and expressions like an actor on the stage, and we, so to speak, fall for it and believe it, or if he adds also words that make us believe that he has certain inner feelings that he doesn't have, then we in a certain way partake in empathy in an illusion or in a lie or in a deception. And on the other hand, it can be also our fault, which the question implies, that we, so to speak, are not really attentive to the ways and forms in which we can, to some extent, grasp the inner life of the person, but we, so to speak, project our own ideas of what the other should feel or does feel into the other person. And that, like, misreading somehow his expressions, misreading his actions, and then the fault for our errors in the empathy is ours, because we, so to speak, we lack the truth-loving, reverent attempt to really partake in the life of the other. Instead, we construct in a certain way another person according to our own whims and wishes.
Thank you for that, Joseph. Professor Crosby, in the last few moments, would you like to add anything on this question of the liabilities within empathy or the proper cultivation?
Yes, no, it's one could perhaps add the idea that there are certain impediments to empathy when another is experiencing something completely foreign to me. For instance, if you've never had a suicidal urge, if that's utterly foreign to you, if it's incomprehensible how a person could want to take his own life, then you approach another who says that he is suicidal, and it can be very difficult to empathize with that. You can understand what he says, but if you yourself have dealt with suicidal urges, you're in a better position to empathize. That is, understand, as the expression goes, what it's like to feel suicidal. If you've been spared that and can't imagine what that's like, then I think there's a certain limit placed on your empathy, not by any moral fault, but there'll be ways of helping and turning to the other with concern, but there may be with that deficit in your own experiencing a certain limit to the empathy you can achieve with someone suffering like that. So that there we touch upon non-moral limits on the range of our empathy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. We're now most definitely out of time, and I thank those of you who stayed with us. That brings to a conclusion this morning's sessions. Thank you, Professors Crosby and Seifert. And I remind all of you that this afternoon we have our greatly anticipated session with Bishop Robert Barron and Rocco Buttiglione speaking on the witness of St. John Paul II. We anticipate a much larger audience than we've had in previous sessions, so you can already begin to access the session 30 minutes prior to the start time, which is 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you just want to log on and enter the session, that will avoid a traffic jam at the end, which would delay the session. So I look forward to seeing you there, and thank you all for being with us this morning. See you soon.
I hope you will record this session, because during the same time I have another class on the ontological proof for the existence of God in German.
Yes, all the sessions are being recorded.
So I cannot unfortunately participate. I would be loved.
Everything is being recorded, and for those of you who have in any way come late to a session and want to immediately see, for example, a session from earlier in a day, all of the sessions are being streamed live to Facebook. And so if you go to the Hildebrand Project's Facebook page, you can there see, you can access the videos from all of our sessions. And then later in the summer, video from the seminar will be also added to our YouTube page, but for our YouTube channel. But for the time being, visit Facebook for any immediate re-listening or listening to sessions that you've missed.
Wonderful.
So, thank you all. See you all soon.